Hello everyone, this is Module 3, and for this module we'll be talking about pricing generally. Our objectives for this module are we're going to describe the general process of pricing a construction estimate. I want to explain the concept of the various risks that are associated with doing your estimates for projects. And then get into describing some of the main components that are you should consider when pricing labor and equipment. We have another module that's going to be specifically about equipment. So I'm really going to concentrate more so on the pricing component on the labor side. So let's just put a definition to pricing, but pricing from the standpoint of construction estimating. Pricing is really just the process of converting your quantity takeoff that you've done on a project, and you're going to take that information and change it into dollar values, okay? One of the big things to really consider is that, yes, this is your project as of now, but you also have to put in place of that the time value of money. You know, what will the estimate be a little bit later on? So it's important for you to think about, putting a various percentage on that estimate so that you're not in a situation where you're not making a profit on the project, as well as you're not going to have a bid that you submit that's going to be, where it's not supposed to be as far as a submission of a bid. And you have to also consider the fact that you're competing against other contractors, and being able to look at your estimate overall and the way that you price it, you have to consider all of the various contingencies that might come into place. And it could be your weather conditions during that time of year. It could be a labor shortage. There could be issues with the various resources that you have. Maybe there are some delays in the schedule that you need to make sure that you place in there. There's a lot of little things that are hidden sometimes that you don't always consider. So we really have to think in terms of, yes, this is today's value, but where is it going to be some 3 or 6 months from today? This right here basically are guidelines for pricing. Now, when you were in estimating 1, what you should have done was concentrate primarily on quantity takeoff, okay? And as you were going through, you probably summarized the material quantities as well. I'm not 100% sure if you did recapping, but what you should have then done is take the quantity takeoff and place just your actual total quantity on the pricing sheet for your recap sheets. Typically, your recap sheets are going to be done, they're supposed to be done through divisions. And what's actually in your project manual, you need to look at your project manual and see what is required and what divisions are going to be used for that project, okay? I really like using the CSI master format because it does gives you some consistency as you're working across the board from project to project. And there should be a layout that you have a spreadsheet or whatever it is if you have a software that you're using. But for every project, you should have some sort of a format that's going to be consistent whenever you submit bids. And you could kind of feed off of that and utilize it as much as possible. Now, after you get through doing your recap, you should get into pricing the overall materials from your quotes. Now, very key, and it's definitely important, is making sure that you actually take the time out to do your estimate, and then you're also going to price it. Now, there are various ways to price. There's the RS means that we'll look at this semester. There's historical data, which a lot of companies go off of historical data quite a bit. But we don't have historical data, so we will concentrate on the use of the RS means cost data. And outside of that, in a real life scenario, say for instance, if you did have a project, you would then ask for quotes to come in. And typically, you're going to take about 3 quotes. From there, you're going to add quotes from subcontractors or suppliers, add indirect costs, such as your overhead, bond, insurance, and permits. Allow costs from items that are not shown on the drawings. So that's when it gets into really your overall due diligence that you did in the very beginning stage of, should I bid on this project or should I not bid on the project? That's where all of this comes into place. All those extras that you really thought about when you went out and you visited the site. You should have took note of some of the things that maybe you don't see on the drawings or maybe you don't see in the project manual. So the site visit really does help bring up, various issues that you may not have even thought about. So we're going to account for as much as we possibly can, but not over the top. We're going to try to find that balance in that even margin area. Also, we're going to add owner's cash allowance for this portion of the work, allow any kind of other contingencies. And then this is very key. Remember how I said about the time value of money. We want to make sure that we add profits to get a total price. And then that could anywhere be from 5% to 10%, and just adding that into the overall cost. Now, the process of pricing, it's really divided into two stages. There's preparing the quantity takeoff, like we already said, this is what you did last semester, and you're pricing by sorting and listing all of the takeoff items under trade section breakdown. And then also, we're going to go into pricing the sorted list of items and make it into what's called a recap, and that's pricing all of those sorted list of items. A few other things about recap is that the reason for preparing the recap is really to just bring together all of the work of a similar nature so that the estimator really can just concentrate on the needs of one trade at a time. And that's really great because if, say, for instance, you were in a meeting and you were, say, shortlisted and you came in for a bid interview, and the client, they ask you a question, well, could you break down the excavation portion of your estimate? Well, you would have it right there explaining, this is my breakdown of this particular item. And you could work through it and explain it to them. So I think it's a great thing to do, price listing and sorting out by each division. And it really does paint this overall picture for you for just breaking it up by subs as well. Doing a recap also, it helps to break down areas of estimate so that if you have a specific question, it's helpful as well. So for instance, as an example, you would say, what is the total amount and estimate for excavation equipment? Or what about the labor? What about the material? So you can really just break this down as much as possible to help you out. This is an example of pricing recap for masonry. Here you'll see your quantity, and then you'll have the actual units that go from here. But you can see how we've broken this down: masonry trim, soldier course, roll-outs, sills, coins. And I'm just going to go through and do my quantity, and then the next step from there, I'm actually going to take it and price it, okay? And these are some other typical trade breakdowns that you would do. You could break it down, and like I said, the best way to do it is to break it down through the CSI master format and do it by divisions. That's just a general rule of thumb in our industry, is to do it that way. But as an example, you've got, just think about the sequence and the order of construction. And that's really the best way to do any kind of planning for a project, is think about the sequence and to not get that sequence out of order. Some of you have had scheduling. I think for the most part, most people have not had scheduling in this class. But I really do talk about the importance of having a vision overall for that project and following through with that vision step by step. And this is what we're doing, the same thing with the estimate. We are painting a vision step by step of how much it's going to cost along the way as we're building this project. So as you can see, excavation, concrete, formwork, concrete finishes, carpentry work, and any other miscellaneous things that we want to mention as well. Now, as far as the manual process, once the recap is really prepared, then you get into the pricing procedure at that point. And pricing a construction estimate, there are really 5 price categories that you will typically see, whether it's in Excel, in a computer software that does estimating, whatever the case may be. But these are the main 5 areas that you're going to see, and that's going to be labor, equipment, materials, your subcontractors, and the job overheads, okay? Now let's just talk a little bit about, what are my risks as a contractor? Because at the end of the day, we're not talking about, oh, this is a project and I'm just going to put a price on it and that price is going to stick and it's going to be perfectly fine. We do not live in that type of world. So we really have to be very realistic, and we have to tell ourselves at the end of the day, there's always going to be some sort of risk associated with a project. And one of the biggest things that you could do would be to do an overall analysis of the risks that are associated with that project, and then to sit back and say, this is how we're going to handle those risks. The contractor's risk affect pretty much all of the categories that I just mentioned. And one of the big questions that you'll ask yourself at the end of the day is, will the GC lose money or are they going to make a profit? And as you can see here, this right here is our planned cost, whereas as we go over here, we see our final cost. And one of the things that you're going to be monitoring as a construction manager or a project manager, whatever the case may be in the field, as you're doing your payments and you're allocating resources, you're figuring out everything through the construction phase. You really have to make sure that there is a balance and that you're not going over. And if you go over, then how do you compensate for it the next month? So you really have to figure out, how do we do our budget? How do we figure out how to run this project successfully? And you're going to be explaining this to a client and helping them to feel reassured that, yes, I can do this at a great dollar amount, and I want to make sure that we're not going to have a lot of cost overruns. Now, depending upon the contract type, remember we've talked about unit price, lump sum, guaranteed maximum price cost plus a fee, puts you either at a more risk or less risk. And we've already kind of talked about the difference between the various risks that you might have with those contract types. But at the end of the day, losing money in the process is really not what we want to do, okay? We want to try our best to stay as close as we possibly can to our planned cost. Now, the one that we will typically see as a lump sum contract, and because this is where normally you're going to do the lowest bid, and it's that of a competitive bid nature. Lump sum contract, the contract really agrees to perform the work for the bid price. And very key here is making sure that the work is actually done for the cost that was actually quoted, okay? So making sure that work does not cost more than the price that's offered. Only where the owner makes changes does the contract price actually change. So any extra cost, it's going to be coming out of the contractor's pocket. Just some examples of lump sum contract risk. One is the takeoff quantities are too low. And this is why it's very important from the very beginning stage. You need to make sure that you do a really good quantity takeoff from the beginning. It's something that's not rushed through. You've thought about it. You've actually went through the project manual and made sure that you've identified everything that needs to be quantified and not miss anything. Every once in a while you may miss a few things here and there, but then again, also the thing is making sure that you put that buffer in there so that if you do miss something, you have that contingency in place. The other thing is productivity does not meet anticipated productivity. Maybe you thought it was going to go this way and that planned cost, but then once you really start building, you find out that you have a lot of other problems, and that's going to make your productivity go down. And along with productivity, that's going to affect quality because of the fact that it's affecting the schedule. And if you remember, the responsibilities in construction is that triangle, right? At the top of it always is the cost, and then time, quality, safety being in the middle. And if any one of those things are affected, it affects everything else, okay? Material suppliers, they fail to meet obligations. I mean, yes, it looks great on paper, but we have to be very realistic and realize that it's not going to always go the way that it's planned and the way that it's on the paper, okay? So 2 basic methods for pricing labor and equipment. The first one is the use of productivity rates. This is where you're going to take your quantity takeoffs and you're going to convert it into labor hours and equipment hours, okay? Then outside of that, you're going to get into applying like all of your wages, equipment rates to the total hours to obtain the estimated labor and equipment prices for that project. With the second method, you're going to use a unit price or material price, and you're going to apply that to your actual quantity takeoff. Now, that is really the one option that I would say is typically used the most. And we'll talk a little bit more about as to why here in a minute. Let's begin to talk about pricing labor. A labor hour is defined as a worker working for 1 hour, okay? And there are a few things that are required to determine the labor hours. One is the quantity work to be placed. Okay, that's going to be the first thing. And then the other is just the productivity rate for that specific crew that will perform the work. And there is a formula in place for that where it's, your productivity rate equals the labor hours over your quantity. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go through here on that. Considering productivity rate, the productivity rate for a specific crew that will perform the work, there's a few things that we need to consider. First, knowing that productivity rate can be expressed as a number of labor hours per unit of work, okay? Quantity of work performed by a crew doing a standard 8-hour day. So whenever we're looking at this from a standpoint of, how long are we actually going to include in this, we're going to say that we have a typical crew that's working a standard 8-hour day. Now, if you need to add more to that, then by all means do whatever you need to, because every project's going to be a little bit different. Maybe you have a more specialized project where you have longer work hours than 8-hour days, so you would have to take that into account. But in general, usually you're going to do a standard 8-hour day. Productivity rates can also come from a number of sources, but primarily in our industry, we'll find that most people use historical data. As we go through here, I wanted to just address some of the formulas that you would use, and maybe you're aware of some of them, but just kind of recapping and reviewing over it. This right here is the formula for productivity rate, labor hours over quantity. Historical productivity rate is also determined by dividing all of your total number of labor hours and then also complete a task by the actual quantity of work performed. This is just an example, and I just wanted to just kind of show you how you would work through a problem using historical productivity rate. Let's say, for instance, you have a type of work where there's an 8x8 16-inch concrete masonry unit. Your quantity of work is that you're going to be able to do 1,700 square feet and a labor cost of $6,987. Your labor hours would be 170 labor hours. So just a matter of utilizing that formula that I gave you earlier, and you have 170 labor hours, and then that is considered, your labor hours, 170, and then dividing that over the quantity, which was 1,700 square feet. And that's going to give you a productivity rate of 0.1 labor hours per square feet, okay? Now, the other thing is to determine estimated number of labor hours for a task using productivity rate is looking at your labor hours. So this would be the formula for labor hours. Labor hours equals whatever that quantity takeoff was times your productivity rate. Okay, so you can interchange these formulas too and manipulate them so that they work out to solve your problem. Now, I wanted to share a few examples with you so that you can begin to understand, how am I going to utilize this in real life? So if we determine man hours per unit, man hour per unit is how long it actually takes one person to do 1 unit of work. And it's obtained typically from historical productivity information, like I said earlier. Okay. As you can see in this chart that I've given you, it kind of gives you, I would say, a good breakdown of how you could utilize this particular method. It gives you a list of all of the items, okay? That's going to be the first column. The next column is the quantity, and then it talks about the various units, okay? And then last, you'll have your man hours. And it's a matter of taking that information, and then you're just simply given an overall extension of everything, and you have your total price down at the bottom. And that's going to be your labor cost subtotal, okay? Now, remember how I said that, this is your labor cost, but you want to add some additional things to that, okay? So at the end of the day, outside of the wages and whatever else that you're adding in, you're going to have some additional things that you would add to that overall cost as well, okay? Now, this is also an example of the way in which you would have adjustments where you're looking at, what are some of the problems that might come up. And they're really, I like to say that they're mistakes that are fairly common in our industry that sometimes you just overlook. And if you know that if you're a contractor and you're like, this is a pretty specialized project, or, we are dealing with some conditions that are a little unusual and maybe we're not used to it, there is a formula that you can use for adjusting labor hours, okay? So some of the common mistakes, just kind of going over them: availability of work, climatic conditions, working conditions. Maybe you have a limited area to actually store materials. Sometimes you get into situations, especially when you work downtown area, and just having access to a site, that can be kind of difficult to work through. So you really want to work through the logistics of how you would get equipment in and out, how trucks are going to get in and out of your job site. All of that is effect. Time is of money and is of the essence. So anytime you get in a situation where people are waiting and they can't even get on your job site, you're wasting money, okay? Nature of the project, small or a big project. I mean, it really does, whether it's a small project or a big project, it's a big difference, especially with the resources that you have. If you don't have the right resources in place, doing a big project may not be the best ideal for you, okay? But this is adjusted labor hours. This right here is an example using the adjusted labor hour formula. And it's dealing with small transformer. It normally takes 3 hours to actually set a small transformer. But then you realize, hey, this is a fairly difficult job. And then you decide, well, you know what, because of that, and because I feel as though there's going to be some issues that are going to come up that maybe I'm not familiar with, I'm going to add 25% to make sure I've covered all the possible losses that I might have with this particular project or the site conditions. And then you have the adjusted man hours for the transformer. If you look at it, I would have 3 times 100% plus added on that 25%. It gives me 3.75 labor hours instead of the typical 3 labor hours. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a buffer there. Okay. Now, there are a few things to consider when we're talking about recording man labor information. The first thing is just going to be the materials and the installation method, okay? Just thinking through that process. The types of jobs. Is this a new construction project or is it a renovation project? Am I going to have to do demo or am I not going to have to do demo? I mean, doing demolition, that takes a lot of time and also a lot of money. So you really want to think through all of that, the types of jobs, whether it's residential, non-residential, it doesn't matter. You really have to think through the type of job. The crew, one work or a team, including supervision and apprentice. Do you have a big crew that you're used to working with? Or is it a small crew? Or is this crew experienced? All of that you have to take into account with productivity rate. Your tools and equipment, that's another thing. You know, hey, are these top of the line tools and equipment that I'm using, or are they really old? I mean, is that going to slow down production? Also, you're thinking about rental rates as well. You know, how much does it cost if I were to keep this on the site for a while? Am I going to have to figure out how to utilize this particular crane so that I don't have to take it down and put it back up again? Because it's going to be a lot more cost effective for you in the long run if you can keep that crane in one location instead of taking it down, reinstalling, and doing a whole nother process over again, okay? So also just the weather conditions. We always have to consider weather conditions. And of course, just remembering that historical data. The next thing that we need to consider is wage and equipment rates. You're going to add this on top of the other information that you've included in your overall estimate. So we've got wage rates that represent your average rates. And that's going to vary according to location. And you're going to include your base wage rates, payroll additives, and some other things. And also, we've got equipment rates that we'll consider. And that's more or less, you know, looking at ownership costs and also rental rates. That is going to be a huge factor overall in your overall estimate in the long run. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the module and we'll have another part where we'll talk more about wage and equipment rates. Thank you.